Schumpeter said that Menger come more or less out of the blue, which of course is not right. Nobody comes out of the blue.
It's been 150 years since the book that forever changed the way we see value was published. It's been 100 years since the death of its author, a man born in a country ridden with poverty and political conflict. Just over 30 years later, he would be a tutor to the heir of the Austro-Hungarian throne, a professor at the University of Vienna, and the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. The man who corrected the errors of Karl Marx and Adam Smith, and yet a man who is completely unknown to the majority of today's students of economics. Many conferences and seminars were held in honor of these anniversaries. We've seen a wave of scientific publications, commemorative speeches, and YouTube vlogs.
Well-modeled head.
There was even a petition to lend his name to one of the roundabouts in his hometown. A Viennese NGO organized an online video event and miraculously brought Menger back to life for several days. These have been fantastic opportunities to tell the story of Menger and his influence from its beginnings all the way to the present. But Menger is many stories in one. The earliest memory Menger's son recalls was a bonfire in which Karl is said to have burned all his correspondence and private notes 10 years before his death. For economists, memories of Menger extend back to his time on the Vienna Stock Exchange. Its ever-changing stock prices inspired him to describe the phenomenon of marginal utility. For the world at large, Karl Menger's life began in the perfect birthplace for one of the empire's greatest modernizers. In Novi Sącz, with 7,000 inhabitants. Here, we find the very first record of our protagonist.
Z tego aktu chrztu, który zachował się w kolegiacie, który jest pierwszym dokumentem o istnieniu Carla Mengera na świecie, wnioskujemy bardzo dużo faktów, które tak naprawdę odsłaniają nam realia tego życia tutaj w Nowym Sączu. Tutaj jest 23 lutego 1840 roku, więc to jest data narodzin. Dalej mamy 12 marca, to jest data chrztu. Okres pomiędzy narodzinami Karla a chrztem, który jest bardzo długi, może nam zasugerować, że Karl był bardzo zdrowym dzieckiem. Zazwyczaj w Galicji, kiedy dziecko rodziło się słabe, chorowite, chrzczono je niemal błyskawicznie po narodzinach, obawiając się tego, że po prostu może przedwcześnie umrzeć. Dalej mamy 22 i to jest numer domu. Urodził się pod numerem konskrypcyjnym 22, czyli właśnie w tym budynku. Ta kamienica należała do rodziny Kostarkiewiczów. To wszystko nam pokazuje ten mały świat Mengerów, który tutaj był i możemy identyfikować kolejne miejsce poza kolegiatą właśnie z Mengerami. A dalej są dane rodziców i jest tutaj szlachetny Antoni Menger, Antonus Menger, de Wolfsgrün. Tytuł Wolfsgrün możemy przypuszczać, że został nadany ojcu Karla, Antonowi Mengerowi, za to, że pojechał odważnie na koniec świata austriackiego do Galicji i mało tego, bardzo lojalnie i dobrze wywiązywał się ze swoich obowiązków. I dalej mamy mamę, Karolina Gerżabek, córka Józefa i Teresy Nata Kalaus. To była bardzo ciekawa rodzina w ogóle, bo Gerżabkowie przybyli znowu z Czech. Dorobili się na wojnach napoleońskich i postanowili zainwestować ten majątek właśnie tutaj. I ostatnia rubryka to są chrzestni i to jest dosyć ciekawe, bo tutaj chrzestnym jest Józef Gerżabek, czyli wygląda na to, że jest to dziadek. I dalej mamy chrzestną, czyli Teresę Gerżabek, która jest ciotką Karola. Maniowe to był majątek, który Gerżabkowie kupili, zainwestowali w to pieniądze, przenosząc się z Czech. Kupili właściwie majątek w wielkiej ruinie po prostu i rozwinęli ten majątek dosyć prężnie, bardzo też przychylnie odnosząc się do swoich chłopów.
Shortly after Carl is born, his father leaves the family with his in-laws and goes on a business trip to Biała to open a shop. His mediocre results could have been a consequence of the economic breakdown at the time. 3 years of poor crops and a 4-fold price increase had led to a bloody peasant revolt against the gentry.
W 1846 roku trwa rabacja galicyjska. Chłopi wyruszają, żeby mordować swoich panów. Rozpoczyna się rzeź. Tymczasem ta historia jest dla dziadków zgoła inna niż dla większości ziemian, ponieważ ich chłopi garżabków chronią. Tworzą straż chłopską i dzięki temu garżabkowie z rabacji wychodzą bez szwanku. Garżabkowie mieli całkiem inną perspektywę względem chłopów, względem tych, którzy dla nich pracowali, niż przeciętny ziemianin z Galicji. Byli kupcami, nagle trafiają do majątku, nie mają tej mentalności takiej gnębienia chłopów. Oni patrzą inaczej na tych chłopów, bardziej z ludzką twarzą.
Carl's earliest memories revolved around fear for his family members' safety during the revolt and his father at work in his book-filled study.
Anton Menger wyjeżdża do Bielska w drugiej połowie lat 40. Tam zakłada biznes włókienniczy, wchodzi w politykę. W roku 1848 na fali Wiosny Ludów zostaje wybrany na posła. Niestety zachorował i zmarł na początku sierpnia 1848 roku.
Sadly, his father passed away when Carl was only 8 years old.
And left the family and the widow with 10 kids. 6 of these kids have survived. 3 sisters who survived and 3 brothers. You can imagine that it was a catastrophe and a disaster for the family.
It's definitely a switch that is turned in the life of young children. They have to be more independent than other children, probably.
Carl used to recall that his mother impressed him with her work, and despite the family's modest means, she was always able to make ends meet.
Około 1843 roku Carl Menger opuszcza Nowy Sącz, wyjeżdża do swoich dziadków, do Gerżabków, do majątku Maniowe, gdzie ogląda życie miejscowości, gdzie patrzy może jako dziecko na te stosunki dwór-chłopi. Skoro te stosunki były dobre, to Menger nieraz zawędrował z dzieciakami nad rzekę, obserwował pracę chłopów, był związany z tymi ludźmi, którzy tam żyli.
Carl is a participant observer. He explores the local trails with his elder brother Max and younger brother Anton. Together they play with their peers, watch people work, and even help to the extent they can. You find them everywhere. They need to know and understand everything. All of this happens during a momentous historical moment, the abolition of serfdom. Despite good grades, Carl repeats a second year of school.
He repeated the last class in Biała voluntarily. We don't know the reasons. In 1850 and 51, he came to the gymnasium in Szczecin.
After enrolling in gymnasium, that is high school, in Szczecin, young Carl generates his first earnings tutoring his younger colleagues. His very first student was his landlady's son. The gymnasiums back then were focused primarily on the humanities and on foreign languages, French, English, and classical languages, Latin and Greek. High school is also the place where Carl polishes his writing style, clear, precise, but at times a bit repetitive.
Every day they started their lessons with morning mass. 1 year before, it was a Catholic gymnasium, and the teachers stayed at that school. The whole atmosphere in that school was Christian, Catholic.
They weren't probably the students who would just sit on their place and listen to their instructors and do what they were supposed to do.
Była to taka typowa pruska szkoła, ostra szkoła, gdzie z uczniem, szczególnie w szkole średniej, ale i też w szkole elementarnej się zupełnie nie patyczkowano, o czym przekonał się też Menger.
They had some disputes with the teachers concerning religion. Anton Menger, the younger brother, denied the dogma of original sin, and that caused some problems.
Niestety musi opuścić placówkę i zostaje przeniesiony do Gimnazjum Świętej Anny w Krakowie.
Karl spends a year in Kraków. Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a Pole fighting beside George Washington in the American Revolutionary War, piques his interest. Karl writes a poem about him. In the spring of 1859, Karl graduates from St. Anne High School with honors. In the autumn, he packs his books and inkwell and departs for the city that will be associated with his name forever, Vienna, the empire's capital.
Vienna in the 19th century was an amazing and terrifying place to be.
The state was almost bankrupt. They had lost the war in Italy.
It's stated by historians that the Austrian Empire was one of the most backward ones in the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century. They caught up very quickly.
Karl arrives in Vienna, which is undergoing the biggest change in its history. The Emperor Franz Joseph I decided to bulldoze the medieval defensive walls.
That was the end of Vienna, where is now the ring. There was the traditional medieval walls of Vienna, and the ring was, I think, 1865 was finished.
The government sold off the territories of the old fortifications of the city.
168 million goblins were received from the selling, and this was invested in Vienna.
And you built all the palais, you built the university, you built the parliament.
Beautiful, large houses by famous architects.
Apartment buildings, bank branches, the palaces for rich families.
This was a construction site, one construction site. When Menger started here, it was one construction site.
There was a lot of investment coming into Vienna, but it was also a huge conglomerate from the entire nations of the empire. People moved into Vienna.
The people who rushed to Vienna were highly talented, were interested in doing new things.
What an enormous growth. A lot of poverty, a lot of difficulties of the life, but still people run away from villages where there was complete poverty and try to find themselves out in this new urban market environment.
There's probably no other city in the West which was as diverse as Vienna was.
Greatest place to be if you had an interest in social phenomena.
Rapidly growing Vienna surprises Menger with its optimism and hospitality.
For him, it's fascinating, the city, the huge city, the constant movement, the construction sites, and the huge stock exchange. There was definitely economic boom.
Very optimistic look into the future in how technology and entrepreneurship will improve the living conditions of the people, and you can see that already starting in Vienna.
Constitution is reenacted. Press has much more freedoms. University reform is underway. You could choose any textbook you wanted.
Karl is not able to enjoy it for too long, and after his first year at the university, he packs his bags again. And thus does Karl Menger, a student of his father's profession, arrive in his mother's homeland.
There would be the emperor on the bridge. Well, I don't know specifics about Menger decision-making, but it was pretty normal back then to study at different places of the Austrian monarchy.
Two philosophy professors left Vienna University when Menger left Vienna, and several other professors came to Prague just when he came here. So we don't really know whether this is the reason, but it wouldn't be uncommon if academic reasons were behind his choice.
At that time, the universities exploded. The numbers of students increased.
there was a room and space for intellectual development.
Menger came to Prague just at the time when the major university reform was underway in Austria, in Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was much freer in what could he choose, which professors he could listen to. So then you could choose the professor you would listen and compare, go from class to class.
If we talk about how economics is being taught, this is very interesting because there is not such a thing as you study economics. In Austria, you study the law and then you study Staatswissenschaften, the science of how the state is run.
Which actually helped to create a very good framework for the study of social sciences, because law was always connected to economics.
As a lawyer, you learned to use logic, precise terminology, scientific foundation, and you applied that to political economy too.
Otherwise, it's really hard to put in economics in a field of subjects, and you can only go wrong.
In these law studies, there is a reform. Legal evolution tradition was introduced. And that is kind of a liberal view of law which dissociates law from the state and introduces spontaneous order of law.
By the time Carl passes his first exams, cum laude, he's living next to a street which from medieval times until today has been a huge marketplace.
He studies a lot, but he also parties. That's definitely what we know. He liked to drink a beer here or there.
The students were male, exclusively, and almost everyone was a member of one or the other fraternity.
The city was partied, so there was one German parade, German street, called Am Gruben, na Příkopě, and there was the Czech street, which is Národní, which is just ahead of us. Menger is a part of this German society.
Carl Menger very much saw himself as part of the Germans.
It's not anti-Czech in any way. He had quite an attachment to the German cultural world, which was of course a connection back then to Western Europe as well.
Fraternities were very different, and there were some fraternities who did this fencing.
And they would have some sort of armor, but their cheeks would be free. When they were fencing, one fencer might get another on his cheek, and he might have a scar on his cheek.
Much more tough than today.
Carl begins writing long before he founds the Austrian School of Economics. In his first works, he focuses on language as an institution, human perception, and the weakening role of marriage in society. But economics fascinates him, and before too long, he's discussing economic issues, the pros and cons of free trade, money as an institution. And he even writes an essay on the impossibility of communism that may not seem particularly bold or original in the 21st century. But let's not forget, this is 1861, and Carl Menger is 21 years old.
All kinds of nations, all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different levels of economic development and political traditions. Menger just understood that centrally planning a society, the economy, it's just impossible.
It was not his critique of communism, but his critique of the quality of education that caused serious problems for Carl.
In 1862, Menger is a young journalist at the Prague journal called Tagesbote aus Böhmen, and he protests against the changes at the university. Liberal professors are away in Vienna, sitting in the parliament, doing reforms, which Menger appreciates, but they are not there at the university where Menger needs them at the time. He protested. He wanted to keep the liberal atmosphere of the university he was witnessing when he was entering the university in Prague. The dean was outraged, and he forbade Menger some freedoms, some academic freedoms. What are you doing? You are just my student, and you are trespassing my orders. We have press freedom, we have academic freedoms. I can say what I consider is right.
This shows a very important trait of Carl Menger in early years. He was very self-determined.
I'm standing for these academic freedoms and for these press freedoms.
He didn't shy away from conflicts.
And I know you are a professor, I respect you and your position, but this is my opinion and I'm standing for it.
He could fight for his opinion, and he did that.
And then the professor didn't let Menger pass several courses, which is part of the academic freedoms taken out from him.
He was actually kicked out of the university because the dean did not share his views.
After such a dispute, Menger is just clearly dissatisfied. He has nothing to the left in what he loved before in Prague. He understood very clearly that he would have no academic future in Prague even if he wanted to.
Carl, embittered by what had happened with his scientific career, is looking for a new start. For over a year, he occupies the position of junior editor in Lemberg Zeitung in Lviv.
He just needed to make a step further, and the step further is journalism.
In Lemberg, he acted as a journalist. He followed for the local gazette the news about the economy, the stocks, exchange things, and the different information.
Besides stock market quotations, Carl left other traces. They say more about his mood than the economic situation.
There is a description of Maniovi and the environment of Maniovi in the Lemberger newspaper. You see there that the guy who wrote that, and I suppose it was Menger, loves this part of the country. It is warm-hearted. He describes the people there, the landscape. He described how the people there do the fishing in winter by picking ice holes in the ice of the river.
Menger w Maniowych spędzał czas z okolicznymi mieszkańcami, nie tylko kręcił się w okolicy majątku swoich dziadków. Niejednokrotnie zapewne zawędrował nad rzekę do chłopców, którzy przecież byli w jego wieku. Na pewno bawił się z nimi, obserwował też życie ich rodziców. To w przyszłości zapewne zostawiło też ślad w Carlu Mengerze.
He had a relationship to that landscape.
He decides to abandon an attribute he's carried since childhood, von Wolfeschgrün, a nobility title he wasn't able to trace and which didn't really fit his liberal attitude. What suits him better, he finds, is the beard he's started to grow, a beard that was supposed to cover his cuts from fencing duels during his time in Prague. Lemberg Zeitung closes after 1 year, and Carl finds a similar position at the liberal-oriented, state-run Vienna Botschafter. And yes, it was both liberal and state-run.
When he arrived in Vienna, he was at some point working for the cabinet, especially checking the newspapers and the news and making reviews and preparing documents for the government.
Economic journalists usually make market reports, like the price of wheat in Prague, in Vienna, in Graz.
That means that you have to be in touch with the reality of what the people are actually living, how they make transactions in their lives about material things.
They also were sent to the world fairs, where the whole world would witness technological innovations from all corners of the world.
In total, there were about 6 newspapers he wrote for.
Some newspapers that are close to the government line, which at the part was the more liberal line, and some very popular, even tabloid style. Seems to have been pragmatic about where to write.
Stock market reports and satirical short stories, renowned government papers and tabloids. Carl can reach different audiences. And then the idea arises of combining 2 different kinds of content under one title. Wiener Tagblatt, financed only by advertisements, wants to cover issues previously restricted to more serious publications, for an audience accustomed to reading about more mundane topics.
A journalist, but not for the sake of journalism, but for the sake of the real life of the people.
The man on the street needs to read it needs to know why the price of the bread is as high or as low, or how markets work.
To, co widział w Maniowych, to, co widział w tych galicyjskich miastach, wywarło na nim taki wpływ, takie przekonanie, że edukacja jest najszybszą drogą do rozwoju.
Wiener Tagblatt promotes various causes like reform of the penitentiary system and opening inexpensive grocery markets for citizens of limited means. It lobbies in support of the unemployed as well as for public libraries.
He always wanted to make sure that people are better off and can learn and can advance and can elevate themselves. That those who are poorer or less well off should be provided the opportunity.
Mimo iż był synem urzędnika, to nie opływał tutaj w luksusach. Te miasta jak Nowy Sącz to były miasta, gdzie można było odczuć tą galicyjską biedę. Szczególnie tutaj, jak popatrzymy przez okno, widzimy dzielnicę Piekło, dzielnicę, gdzie po prostu na wprost tych okien była najbiedniejsza część Nowego Sącza. Menger był w pewien sposób nawet częścią tej biedy galicyjskiej. Chcąc nie chcąc patrzył na nią, chcąc nie chcąc ją widział. Ta relacja była żywa.
Before he writes his principles of economics, he is an entrepreneur. And he also fails as an entrepreneur. So he has all these booms and bust cycles. He experiences that with his own life.
Readers appreciated Menger's paper. But Menger was most valued by the publishers of the state-run Wiener Zeitung. They offered him the option of buying the title back and editing the newspaper's economics section.
When he was doing that work and when he was checking what he had learned in Krakow, in Prague, at the university about economics, and what was actually done every day in the normal business activities, there was such a gap that there was some problem, either with the theory or with the reality. Now, the reality is what it is. Therefore, there is a problem with the theory somewhere. So, what is in need to be provided is a new theory.
After a few years, young Carl feels the desire to return to a more scientific approach to issues about which he is only scratching the surface in the popular newspapers. He resigns from 2 press posts and decides to give himself a few months to decide on his next course of action.
He has finished his coursework, but he doesn't have the title, which would open him many doors to many careers.
He rents an apartment with his younger brother Anton, who has just graduated from law school in Krakow.
And then there is Krakow, which is close to his birthplace. Julian Dunajewski, economics professor, he becomes the rector of the university. Dunajewski is at 3 of Menger's 4 state exams. Menger is just an outstanding student again here, passing all exams with A's, B's. And he then finishes his university finally in March 1867 in Krakow, which is 2 years before the university was fully Polonized.
In September 67, he wrote in his diary, "Wer für mich auf die nationalökonomischen Studien," what means I start to study political economy.
From the moment that he takes that clearly in his mind, he gets into very serious study of political economy as such and is preparing for his project where the Grundsätze is only the introductory.
Over the next 4 years, it is hard to say what is more frequent, Carl's change of jobs or the changes in his vision for his first book. It began as a philosophical treatise through disputes with other authors, to a study of legal reform or the origins of the meanings of economic terms, through to the vision of a book about economic theory. Rather than write a book about the economy of Austria, Carl decides to tell a more universal story, independent of time and place.
Menger's approach is try to understand first before you judge. Try to figure out if there's a way to understand human action without assuming already that everyone else is stupid or immoral and you know better.
Two different takes on economics need to be addressed. These are British classical economics and the German historical approach.
Carla Mengera is somewhere in between, or first it looks like he is somewhere in between.
It is too abstract what the British classical political economists say. It is not helpful to go and just have a lot of facts like the German historicists give.
To correct classic works in value theory, and to explain to his German colleagues that some principles are universal and apply everywhere, including in the German world. Piece of cake, right?
Only over time he realizes himself how far-reaching that is.
And he publishes the Principles of Economics in 1871, when he was just 31 years old. Imagine this huge book, this work, this tremendous collection of wisdom by a 31-year-old. I mean, this is unbelievable.
I believe it was not Menger's decision to write a revolutionary book. He just felt he has a contribution to contemporary debate about political economy. He wanted to talk to German colleagues.
He wants to show the historical school, come on, there's not really just, it's not just German economics. It's like there, of course there are different historical movements and processes, but look at the patterns, look at the processes themselves and see what's more universal and what's more peculiar, and then you'll have a better understanding, even maybe of the German culture and identity.
One of the main topics in economy at that time was the theory of value.
So Carl Menger's theory of value appended the labor theory of value, which states that the value of a good comes from the amount of labor which is used to produce it. The idea is kind of intuitive, right? So, you know, you have to put some effort into something, into a resource in order to make something out of it, right? It takes time and all that. So it's not totally wrong. It's, of course, an aspect of how value comes about.
So it's not only the labor that is important to look at, the price of labor, but you also have to look at the value that a good represents for an individual, for the client, for the customer, for the consumer.
I can spend 1 year producing a chair because I'm not a learned carpenter. That doesn't mean it's worth a 1 year wage. In the end, who will determine what this chair is worth are other people and their subjective valuation of this chair.
So he adds something to what Adam Smith has written.
Menger realized that Adam Smith is able to explain why people trade, but is not able to explain why people stop to trade.
And it was not cost of production that determined value, it was the future use of the good. This must have been very exciting discovery, to turn things around and suddenly to come up with a theory that was able to explain much more than the cost of production theory. Because of course the cost of production theory has many obvious weaknesses.
He basically solved the water-diamond paradox. Why is a diamond worth much more than water? Although a diamond is more or less useless and water is essential for survival. You cannot say that diamonds in general are worth a lot and water in general is worth little. It all depends on the context. If we're in a very developed civilization, we've solved our water problems a long time ago, it's cheaper. But if we're in the desert, one would probably give that diamond, which is back home maybe worth 1,000 times more than a glass of water, we'll trade it in for a glass of water. Not necessarily, the person might prefer to die than give away the ring, but just to make a picture.
So there's no objective value. How can it be?
Also, if you go into a market, like a traditional market where you can still haggle, like not a supermarket where all the prices are fixed, you would also realize that value changes based on the customer. And that would seem unfitting to a more static labor theory of value.
People make the value and not an objective measurement.
He places man at the center of the universe instead of production. It's a subjective value that determines price.
For now we take these things for granted. But back then, nobody was thinking about those values of individuals. Everybody was looking into the prices of labor, and that was it.
I have no idea, actually, what inspired Menger. I think he was a highly original thinker. But of course, he grew up in a house where there was a large library, and he may have read a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment.
Where he got the idea, there's one perspective that he saw price formation live in the Börse, in the stock exchange. Didn't see one fixed price which was not changeable for goods, but actually prices which were changing the whole time.
So this story, it's not completely untrue, but it's anecdotal evidence.
No, I don't think it's the stock exchange that really inspired his book. He was covering the stock exchange, but as part of general necessity in covering real facts as a journalist that wants to be read.
This is one of the questions I always had. How did Menger come to that idea? This could be one way. As a lawyer, he had learned that in Roman law there was the so-called estimatio affectionis, which means the value of sentiment. This is a concept in the Roman law, which was taught at that time in the first 2 semesters. To give you an example, the wedding rings have a high value to someone who is married with that rings and goes far beyond the market value. If you elaborate that idea, you may come to the subjective theory of value.
Carl takes a closer look at people from the other end of the social ladder, rather than stockbrokers or owners of diamond necklaces. What is the utility of every additional tool for a poor shoemaker? What difference does one more kreutzer make for a paperboy? What needs will go unmet if a farmer loses 1 bag of grain? What urgent needs will you satisfy with just 1 liter of water? What needs with an unlimited quantity? Carl was aware of these problems not from his work at the paper or from the Scottish classics, but from his own life. The value you attach to your only liter of potable water is different from the value you attach to the 5th or the 15th liter. The price of a tool with a new use will go up. If a consumer good becomes less popular, the prices of the machines used to make it will fall. This is the Mengerian marginal revolution in a nutshell.
And if one hears this, right, one thinks, yeah, of course, right? So it's simple, you know, why is this so revolutionary? It's revolutionary in perspective of the whole history of economic thought. And this has consequences on how you approach the management of scarce goods.
His revolution was to move value from history of the good into the future of the good, namely the capacity of the good to satisfy human needs. Because the point of all production is, of course, to satisfy human needs.
And if you haven't understood people exchanging carrots and bushels of wheat, there's no way you'll understand money and no way you'll understand the modern economy.
Totally new at that time, in my consideration, is that he wrote about the topos of time and era. And time at that time didn't play a role in political economy. Yeah, it played a role, but it did not play a role in the theory of economy. Also the notion that people can make mistakes.
Menger is not writing about the so-called homo economicus who is always thinking about profit. Menger is writing about the persons who want security. And he says, asking, what is the best institutional setup which help us to achieve security and satisfaction of our needs?
And if you count the term need, how often he uses that term, it's almost 300 times.
And it's really looking, I think, for human universals. That's why his library was mainly based on ethnology.
It is a book about human being.
Menger. It can be an eye-opener, in particular if you compare it to the other works of the time, which are mostly unreadable nowadays. It's well written, it's concise, it's realist, it's not some wishful thinking. It does not have any Nazi or proto-Nazi or socialist ideological extremes in it, which a lot of the works of the time are just that.
The book is one of the first textbooks in political economy which are totally secularized. There is no moral axiom, there is no religion, there is no God, there is nothing transcendent where economy derives from. It's the human being. And this is one of the reasons why this, in my consideration, why this book became so successful afterwards. It was a seed, an early seed for a secularized area. And the people in the 80s understood the book much more. And for them, in the 80s or 90s, it was natural. There was no question about it.
Menger thought, when he published the Grundsätze, his principles of economics, that he had, and correctly he believed, that he had made a revolution in economics. So he was quite disappointed when people didn't take up his ideas and develop them.
Menger's efforts are not accepted very well.
I think he was surprised and maybe upset by the reception of his books by the German historical school.
He was attacked right away by the German historicists. He was not understood.
It got several reviews. Some were positive, some mixed, and one by a person underlined GS, which is Gustav von Schmoller, the head of the younger German historical school, and that is a very critical one.
He was a contender to the general economic narrative, and that obviously causes controversy.
The last chapter of the book Menger presented at the university as his habilitation thesis before it was published sparked controversy too. Lorenz von Stein, the Faculty of Law's leading scholar, is said to have disliked the chapter on the origins and functions of money.
When Menger wrote the Grundsätze, he very soon quit the bureaucratic position and quit politics because he wanted to be a professor, and other people were telling him like, oh, you want to be a professor, poor you, like you will have like minus 50% of income.
Then he gets this position as a docent, and then very soon he becomes professor.
Austria had a painful shortage of economists at the universities. It was very difficult to get people from Germany because most of them were not jurists, they were not lawyers.
The demand for economists with a legal background confirmed Menger's career decision as the right one. The catastrophe of the World's Fair and the stock market collapse make Menger's book more popular.
What happened in this period before the crash was that the people were irrational, totally irrational.
There was a lot of speculating, there was a bit too much optimism.
Companies were founded without any assets.
A lot of people became rich quickly, and other people also wanted to get rich quickly, but with other means.
It was a time when credit slowed quite openly, nowhere comparable to nowadays, but compared to the past, already quite an expansion.
In this business cycle, an exhibition started here in Vienna.
The exposition was probably too big of a project, right? So they set their goals too high. They just expected more activity than there really was.
The weather was not fine. People felt that something is going on. The hotels, which were prepared for that World Fair and expected a lot of visitors, it didn't work.
And the whole thing burned down.
And some weeks later, the crash came down over Vienna.
There's a boom in bus cycles. You know, we get a lot of money injection, we get a lot of investment coming into Vienna, which led to the boom, and then later, of course, to the bust when there is too much money wrongly allocated.
The Gründerkrach, it's called the founders' crisis or crash,
had a huge impact on the development of the society in Vienna.
The New York Stock Exchange was closed for 2 weeks just because of the crash in Vienna.
More than 150 people committed suicide in a town where everybody knows everyone. 150 suicides.
One of the victims was Professor von Stein, who lost all his savings due to the collapse and could no longer afford to live in Vienna.
So even the professors in economy, had gone bankrupt.
The accuracy of the insights in principles of economics and Menger's growing popularity as a lecturer make him known to the emperor's advisors, who are looking for a tutor in political economy for the heir to the throne, Prince Rudolf.
There is a general called Joseph Latour von Thunberg, who actually is the tutor of Crown Prince Rudolf in 1875. He recommends Menger to the emperor as a tutor to the Crown Prince.
Menger was a professor already. Such a position was always very close to politics.
Given the idea that it was the Crown Prince and that he would be heading the empire, that was an important responsibility, at least morally.
And I think Carl Menger also knew that this was no opportunity to spread his personal views and his political preferences.
5 days a week, 2 hours in the morning, and then eventually an hour or 2 in the afternoon. Menger started with the topic, introduced the Crown Prince to the topic for the first half hour, and then the next 1.5 hours, the two of them were elaborating on the topic and were discussing it. He, of course, uses the principles because he has them in his mind, but they would discuss all kinds of literature and books.
It was a German scientist called Streisler. He recovered these notes of Rudolf Prince about the lectures of Menger. And I read these lectures, and it was practically, he followed the wealth of nation.
How to become the ruler of such a huge monarchy, how to understand the economic and societal problems.
They were also discussing the importance of a sound currency, because back then the empire was borrowing a lot of money from the Austrian National Bank. And Menger was concerned of the devaluation, and he was discussing that with the Crown Princess as well. So, economics at its best.
Their studies take place inside and outside of the palace. Both Carl and Rudolf are fond of fishing, which prompts them to discuss fish supply or stimulating demand with bait.
And he spent a lot of time with Crown Prince Rudolf, right? He also traveled a lot with him.
They have almost friendship-like relationship.
More personal than one would have thought appropriate.
Crown Prince was traveling like a civil person, being not discovered as the Crown Prince. They would travel like two friends together and go to pubs together abroad, and it certainly conferred a sense of liberty to the Crown Prince.
For the next 3 years, Rudolf and Carl visit France, Italy, Berlin, and Great Britain, which played a key role in 19th century innovation.
So he shows him the results. And he shows that Great Britain, starting from Smithian and then Ricardian economics, comes into one of the first world power, and how it has industrialized, etc. So much so that the Crown Prince is convinced that it is not enough to have a parade of riches and balls, Strauss family, music, and parades of an army that basically had been defeated. If you want a modern country, you have to go the way that economics brings to modernity.
The archives of St. Anne Gymnasium in Krakow a school Carl graduated from, mention Rudolph's visit in 1880 also.
After Menger delivered his lectures to Crown Prince Rudolph, he became, let's say, liberal. And he represented the liberal movement in Austrian Empire.
So one interesting part of Carl Menger's relationship with Crown Prince Rudolph were pamphlets, especially one famous pamphlet which he helped Crown Prince Rudolph write.
It was published through the connections of Menger, so it was pretty sure for everyone who knew him that he must be involved.
The pamphlet, even though it was published anonymously, it is the result of the travel to the western parts of Europe and seeing how modernization is needed for a country to develop.
He was critical of the general state of the leadership of the empire, of the aristocracy.
He claimed that the aristocracy in Austria was conservative, not meritocratic.
Claiming that they have no elite position anymore because if they're not useful in a modernized society, then it's just they are a thing of the past and should step aside.
He was not really trying to say that you should abolish aristocracy or monarchy. He was saying that the aristocracy should live up to its ideals.
Or take an active responsibility in still maintaining that kind of leadership function, but in a different society, which is not a feudal order, but an open, more commercial society.
And that as long as the court and the nobles in the old imperial style would dominate, then this empire wouldn't be modernizing, could not prepare the empire for what was coming.
At that time, the efforts of the aristocracy to prevent from liberalization were quite clear.
The pamphlet is very explicit on that, and it's been quite attacked by the court for that reason.
I think it was a wake-up call to his peers. But like many wake-up calls in an environment where the people feel quite comfortable, they don't hear it.
Carl struggles with the negative reception of principles of economics among his German colleagues. He changes plans, and instead of writing a sequel, he decides to write a separate book focusing on where we begin when we build theories and how the institutions described by these theories emerge.
So after teaching Rudolph, Menger comes back to his methodology project and finishes the book called Investigations in 1883.
He was still on that line to improve the economics. And okay, if my first attempt is not sufficient, I have to do something more.
And that book sparks the conflict between him and Schmoller called Methodenstreit.
What he feels is that the German economists are not real economists, that they are historians, that they underestimate the significance and importance of economic analysis.
The historic school tells us only history can tell us how the future will look like.
Information, details, names, quantities of history.
They were just accumulating facts.
They were not so interested in, before we look at all the data, what can we know?
It was not the problem that it was historical, it was looking for history, it was selectively looking at history to make a political and then geopolitical point.
The people there were educated to be practitioners, not scientists.
So it's not really out for truth, it's for making truth by using political power and legitimizing political power.
Germans stressed the central role of the state. Menger's approach was more of a spontaneous order approach.
He does not propose a historical, institutional theory. In that sense, he is close to the historical German school, but he wants more.
Menger thinks it's actually conflict against theory. They are opposed to any kind of theory.
Karl Popper has actually described this very well. He has explained the contrast between two kinds of science. One is the Beckett theory of science, and the other one is the searchlight theory of science. The Beckett theory is that you have a bucket and you collect facts into the bucket. This is what the German professors did. The other theory is that you see something which is dark somewhere and you direct a searchlight to it and you try to explain what happened. Oh yes, gosh, this is what happened. This is the Mengerian idea of science, which was then described even better by Popper and by Hayek.
Again, the reaction came from Schmoller, which was a dismissive one. And then it went wild because Menger, as a stiff person, he wouldn't, let Schmoller have the discussion, not that easily for sure.
Schmoller is not very friendly in the way he responds to Menger.
If someone is criticizing it, he's not German enough to understand your objective, so it's all wrong.
Menger takes it very personally, it's very emotional for him.
So many people joined in that it was like a plethora of reactions from German sides and from Austrian sides.
And the war was declared, but maybe it was like a surprise. He didn't want it to make such a contrast with the historical school.
The German historical school, feeling that, was bitterly attacking him, and he had to answer.
Therefore, he writes an attack on them, or a critique of them, which only served actually to make him more of an outlaw in German-speaking countries, except Austria.
To really characterize the Methodenstreit in one sentence, it would be about the nature of institutions, whether they are really top-down institutions or whether they arise from spontaneous orders.
When and how could they emerge if they were not already there?
It means that institutions, money or laws, rules can develop spontaneously.
They emerge out of human behavior. They're not something cosmological, metaphysical. It's a bottom-up process because it emerges out of action of real human beings. And the best example he gives is language. The German language at the time, it cannot be something ideal from heavens because you see the history. You can go back, you see how it emerged, how it has loaned words from other languages. There's no first German speaker.
How do you go from no language to language? How do you go from no money to money? Then once you have some kind of money, it's easier to understand how you change for another kind because it's more absatzfähig, it's more saleable, marketable, and easier to use. But from the start, how do you get the idea of money? Well, he explains about barter, right? That you would change one thing, but then indirect would be more efficient. Spontaneous development of money at some points meets the fact that the state comes in, standardizes, and with simplification, standardization, comes more trust. The illusion that the authority of the state is the reason why this happens is an illusion, and as such it is detrimental.
Money has not been generated by law. In its origin, it is a social and not a state institution. Sanction by the authority of the state is a notion alien to it.
They look at the coin and say, there's an emperor on it, so it's got to be related to the emperor. Or there's a number on it, so it's got to be the number. Carl Menger says, no, I got to understand the function. I got to understand why are people using that, and what did they use before, and what did they use before that, and how could that have emerged?
On this point, the German historical economist did not follow him because he wanted to identify universal law which does not exist to German historicists.
The representative of the historical school in Germany didn't even understand what Menger was talking about. It was too theoretical, too far away.
Economics was either Austrian or it's Jewish. It's just not German because German economics is just what German geopolitical need is.
For the Germans, Carl has made the same mistake again. Just as in Principles of Economics, where it was said he did not take supernatural forces into account, in the new text, he neglected the role of the Zeitgeist, the leading role of the German nation, or the importance of putting collective needs above those of the individual.
We always talk about the economy and the nation, and these are legitimate terms, but they're of course abstractions. In order to be precise and realistic, you first need to start with the basics again, and that's the individual.
Menger says, as long as you are using collective Begriff, collective concepts, you cannot provide an accurate account of what happens effectively in the economy. So you have to start with the individual, dealing with his own needs, given the availability of resources, and what he or she can exchange. If he or she has already everything they need, there is no need to exchange. But if it is not the case, then they exchange. To whom will they exchange? To somebody else. So there is no Robinson Crusoe alone on his island and suddenly discovering Friday and then etc. No, there are many individuals. Each of them think for oneself given the environment, the Außenwelt that is around. Immediately this individual is related to the others. Why does he start with the individual alone? Because you have to start with some point to make the analysis. If I get in touch with someone else, it's because what I have only by myself is not enough. And each of us is doing exactly that. We are entering into interaction. We are making associations. We are building a society. But to analyze that, you have to start from what each of us is doing, because that's the only way to understand why we are doing it. Do you know the intentionality of some monetary aggregates? Do you know the intentions of a country, nation as a whole like that? When you're talking like that, you're making a metaphor. The only understanding that can be clear of why you are entering a transaction is to understand and reconstruct logically the reasoning of the human being that is entering into that transaction. You are doing the only analysis that can bring you to understand the intention of the active agent. Der Wirtschaften, der Mensch.
If one looks now on a limited amount of time, who won the Methodenstreit, the debate on method, I would say it's more the historical school, just because modern science has become much more empirical.
We have to ask ourselves not really the question who won, even if I think Menger did. We should ask ourselves the question, what is more intellectually satisfying? To explain things in terms of unintended consequences, or just to collect data and publish it more or less without doing anything with it? What's more interesting? And I find the searchlight theory of science that is being presented by Carla Mengera and Karl Popper as well, much more fascinating, satisfying, stimulating than just collecting facts into a bucket.
The Methodenstreit is actually a wasted time. This is how Schumpeter actually expressed it. He says it's a waste of time that Carl Menger spent so long in the dispute with Schmöller and with the historic school. He should have used his time in a better way.
A large waste of time and energy. He was wrong. The fact that the ideas that Menger was promoting have become obvious, natural, almost self-evident, was then granted. The Methodenstreit was a moment that established, that permitted, with pain, to establish those ideas as the dominant views. So yes, the Methodenstreit was a necessary episode in the history of the development of economics, not a waste of time and energy.
Menger has his final proof. He does not fit into the German club. What he suggests in his books is not a bridge between the German historical school and the classics. It is a completely new approach. It puts man at the center and attempts to view the economy through his eyes.
It obviously helps shape Menger's way of thinking and way of arguing, and also knowing that the Germans definitely do not like him.
Carl Menger might have been a fringe person in Germany, but he was not at all in Austria, right? So he's very much a very respected economics professor, if not the most.
Menger in his time was well known, and he was a corresponding member of the Académie des sciences morales et politiques, Moral and Political Sciences Academy in France, which is one part of the major French academy. He succeeded Roscher and was chosen instead of Schmoller.
And he has lots of students in all areas of society.
Who else has among his students like 3 ministers and diplomats, excellencies? The highest ranks of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy are filled up with students of Carl Menger. Böhm von Barwerk was Minister of Finance, Victor Mattea was Minister of Social Works, Social Minister. Richard Schüller was immensely important for European history and Austrian history in particular. It could be that there would not be Austria today without Richard Schüller. And Felix Somari was crucially important for banking because he started the private banking industry in Switzerland at a time when no one thought Switzerland would be of any importance, just a poor European country.
Emil Sachs was the first of the series of Menger's friends and students who got the position in Prague, and they took actually a very firm grip of economics in Prague for 6 decades until the Second World War.
And after all, Böhm Barwerk was 3 times Minister of Finance. Pretty successful.
So the Austrian economists actually enjoyed quite a lot of social recognition.
And it was a project of a small elite to maybe use the empire to get it modernized in a better way against the German solution, like the big German solution of creating a German Reich.
People started differentiating between the Germans and the Austrians. You had the German historical school of economics and you had the Austrian school of economics.
It never was a school in the narrow sense. It was quite a loose group. If you look at the biographies and the intellectual profiles of the people allotted to the Austrian School of Economics, they're quite different.
Well, there is something that must be mentioned then. In a letter to the Cultus Ministerium, Menger is making clear that he is conscientiously founding a school. He says that he has already disciples, pupils, and that it is his own intention to develop that as a counterpart to the German historical school. In relationship with my seminar of political economy and finance, Seminar für Nationalökonomie und Finanzwissenschaft, which I have been holding for about 2 decades now, my lecturers have met with quite some success beyond the usual audience that a lecturer would find, and this holds especially about concerning die Begründung der österreichischen Schule der Nationalökonomie, the foundation of the Austrian School of Political Economy. So the word Austrian school is in itself present self-consciously in Menger's writings.
One of the criticisms against the Austrian school is it's just class legitimization. They are all capitalists because they're part of the capitalist class. So if you criticize Carl Menger and claim, of course, he's like from upper class Austrian, of course he's in favor of capitalism, then you've got to criticize Anton Menger as well and say, of course, he's an upper class Austrian, of course he's socialist.
It's very interesting that Carl Menger had 2 brothers. One brother was a liberal, but the other one was a leading socialist.
And if one is the opposite of the other, how come? Maybe class isn't all deterministic as they claim. Maybe race isn't all deterministic as the other side claimed to be.
They met at Landmannscafé and discussed Austrian affairs. It must have been interesting to have listened in to their conversations. Anton was actually quite a leading socialist and had written books that were translated and read in many other countries.
The relationship between Anton and Carl went worse and worse with time. Not for being a socialist, but for putting a cause before the scientific concerns. Carl would reproach his brother with becoming some kind of advocate. Well, for a lawyer, after all, it's quite natural. But Menger thought of his field, economics, as a science as such.
Menger thought that value neutrality is important for economics, which means you want to understand even if you don't like the outcome, and you try to dissociate from your own ideology. You don't give value judgment, you help understand what's going on, as it is, not as it should be. Menger would say, no, I have no judgment on free trade or protected trade. I want to understand trade.
In this regard, the relationship with Marx was much better, because Marx didn't play on the word science on the one hand and the activity of advocate on the other. He was an advocate. He had many relationships with the entrepreneurs. He had also at some point started doing some entrepreneurship, but when he became a representative at the National House, then he would definitely make bridges between that political world and the world of entrepreneurs, and assume that fully he would accept and play that role without saying anything about science. The clarity of the position was fine with Menger Carl. The three brothers, each in their own way, wanted the empire to modernize. You cannot go on in that old frame, old structures. You have to adapt and make the empire strong economically, strong in terms of entrepreneurship, just in order to cope with the future. And if you don't do that, you disappear.
But Menger does not want to disappear. On the contrary, he puts great hope in his students, including those from the university and Rudolf. He does not stop teaching, publishing, and if necessary, working with government commissions.
There is a huge picture at the Academy of Science where we see Carl Menger sitting together with Böhm-Bawerk, who was back then Minister of Finance, and the Emperor in the commission of the Währungskommission, where they discuss how to get from the Gulden, from the silver currency, to the gold currency.
After 20 years, he returns to the same government building, not to collect market data in tables, but to lead the committee that is supposed to save this market.
The big point of those years, 1890 and the following years, is the first great recession, especially in Austria. It's the moment when the Kreditanstalt, major institution in Vienna, fell.
Carl Menger then is part of this study group, you could call it, trying to figure out what's going wrong and how to go when more and more countries are switching to a gold standard.
Menger always argued, be careful, not destroy the trust in money. And this is what we see these days. If you destroy the trust in a currency, then you're in deep problems.
Money is part of every transaction. So if you spoil money, then all transactions are spoiled and it has consequences.
Money is of course a medium of exchange and a unit of accounting. But if you produce too much money, then the price is going to go down. And if the price of money goes down, we have inflation. This is marginal revolution applied to money.
So what he proposes is quite pragmatic. Have a settlement layer in gold coin, try to let the market find out the exchange rates, don't intervene too much.
This monetary reform, this is absolute necessary reform that the country needed, and of course such a professor as Menger was involved in that. But this was for him an episode, let's do this reform, but I'm not interested in big politics on a big scale.
Near the end of his 3 years of leading the Currency Committee, Menger publishes an extensive essay on money. But he's already thinking of something else. After Principles and the Method of the Social Sciences, Menger gets the idea to write about sociology, although this time not to try to explain anything to his German colleagues, simply for his own scholarly satisfaction. At the same time, Menger prepares material for subsequent parts of Principles of Economics, and once again puts off the publication of the revised Part 1. He blocks translations of the first edition into other languages. He promises to allow them only after Part 1 is revised and integrated with the subsequent 4 parts. Menger starts to doubt whether the monarchy will be able to maintain its religious and ethnic diversity against new political movements. The classical liberalism of Menger's generation slowly gives way to socialism and then nationalism and statism.
From the politically liberal perspective, it was the era of decay.
You think that the wealthiest urban parts would be the most liberal ones, and turned out the other way around. It was in the urban centers with the most economic development when nationalism flared up, where the youth became radicalized. The best educated, wealthiest people of the empire becoming radicalized, militaristic, chauvinists. That was all against what the liberals would have expected.
And the more the voting rights became popularized, the less the liberals played a great role in politics.
It is believed that Menger passed on to Rudolf the kind of skepticism about the future, and it would be this skepticism of the Liberal Party.
Menger also warned Rudolf not to be too libertarian and not to be anti these conservative forces that are still operating.
Carla Mengera gave Crown Prince Rudolf a more realistic perspective. He saw where Austria, but also Europe, was going towards.
Mises writes in his memoirs that he thinks it must have been the influence of Carl Menger. I don't think so, because Crown Prince Rudolf had issues.
We just know through the little correspondence we have and information about his life that actually his personal views were unorthodox for the time.
They were a little bit radical, yes.
Unfortunately, Rudolf has committed suicide, and Menger left without a future to be.
Rudolf did not get the chance to improve the processes in Austrian Empire because aristocracy and also the Kaiser Franz Joseph was anti-liberal.
The monarchy was a very monolithic and very stable, and it was not so easy for one person to change that.
The death of Crown Prince Rudolf had a bigger impact on Carl Menger than Carl Menger's premonitions had on the Crown Prince.
He'd lost a promoter and a friend and a protector, a very important part of his network.
As a tutor, if you get the confidence, you'll be put in a very high position once the Crown Prince becomes the emperor.
How many world leaders are actually trained in political economy? So now imagine how special that could be to have a well-educated emperor who would influence most of Europe and sort of contributed to a free social order which would be economically sound and based on some sort of private property underpinning.
The best approach would have been, and that's possible, that Menger would have pushed for a loose confederation of a kind of free trade zone in place of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So radical decentralization and opening, still remaining, keeping the borders open for trade and exchange. That's the best possible outcome we could have seen. And then maybe no world wars, but that's really stretching it a lot.
The world could be a different place with Rudolf in charge and Menger being the intellectual guru of the emperor.
1 year after the death of Rudolf, in one of the Viennese newspapers, a sketch or a brief biography of Crown Prince Rudolf appeared, authorless, and it is typically language of Menger. It is also describing from a point of view of someone who has taught him, who know him very well, who has traveled with him, and there are not so many people. And one of them was Menger, so I'm sure this was Menger.
The suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf was for sure a huge shock to him. And it also detached him from society.
Menger decides to focus on scientific work and detach himself from the monarchy. He finds refuge in his own library, which has been growing day after day from the moment he arrived in Vienna, when the memory of his late father was still vivid.
He was mostly working with his books and in the library. He held a private seminar at home with the best of his students.
A lot of students contacted Menger not only to get to know him, but especially to get to know his library and to be able to study his books.
Menger is famous for his huge collection of books. We can claim that his library is about 20,000 books.
Menger's collecting was much above the norms. Those 20,000 plus volumes were a collection that had almost no equivalent on a private ownership in Europe.
This is a typical Viennese apartment with higher floors. So if you put in like that, it's feasible to have 20,000 books in an apartment full of books.
The collection is actually really a representation of the world that he is evolving in, and is creating that world.
A new figure enters Carl's world, Hermine Andermann, a young woman who brings warmth to Carl's home, not through book collections or scholarship, but thanks to her relationship with Carl. Not everyone is happy with this new element in Carl's world.
Very few people seem to realize that Carl Menger retired because of a family scandal.
Everyone knew that in Vienna, but it happens.
Hermine was a journalist, author, and musician. She was much younger than he was.
It was considered as an not appropriate relation to a lady 30 years younger than he.
Already a relationship that would have been frowned upon in society and made him impossible in upper-class Austrian society.
The relation started in the early 90s, when Hermine was about 20 years. It was a couple which was known in Vienna, but it was considered as inappropriate.
As nowadays, as an old professor, you get a love affair with a student, it'll be a bit frowned upon. Still, in some classes, you'd have less invitations for social gatherings just due to that impossible relationship. And it was, of course, much stricter at the time.
Carl and Hermine's relationship was never confirmed in front of an altar. It is said that Carl's Catholic and Hermine's Jewish background explain it. But Hermine was baptized in Farra-Rossau in December 1893. Had Carl kept his opinions on marriage that he voiced during his time at the university in Prague?
Carl Menger retires from university in 1903. He's a young father. He has a one-year-old son back then.
I believe that Menger actually retired of his own free will. He was embarrassed by the whole episode and he just wanted to be quiet and withdraw and devote himself to then his family and to his studies. He didn't want to be exposed.
A moment before his son is born, Menger is invited to the higher chamber of the Austrian Parliament, Herrenhaus. He will sit there, silent, for over a decade.
It is more promotion as a recognition of the role that he's been playing all during his life at the university and also as a counselor for the valuta reform, etc. But the fact is that he was missing most of the meetings, that his health was not good enough anymore to play any significant role in it, as far as I know.
In 1911, Menger asks the Kaiser to officially recognize his son, born out of wedlock, and the Emperor does so. Soon Menger moves in with Hermine and their son, Carl, spelled with a K. 70-year-old Menger, living outside academia, government committees, newspapers, and court, does not surrender. He is left with his most important task, finishing the series he began 40 years earlier with the first volume of Principles of Economics.
After discovering the existence of the archive in Japan, I discovered from this copy of the Grundsätze that Menger was himself using. And I could imagine him writing in order to prepare for the second edition of his book.
Carl Menger zażyczył sobie dostarczenie specjalnego wydania jego zasad ekonomii, gdzie do każdej strony drukowanej będzie dołączona druga czysta strona. W tym momencie on sobie już zdawał sprawę, że trzeba będzie przygotować nowe, ulepszone wydanie jego zasad.
He was rewriting it constantly. If we look at his version, he had tons of notes in there.
Once you have 20,000 books, you realize, oh my God, I need maybe 100,000. The more books you have, the more links you get to new books to look into. So it's a kind of exponential development of his library.
Menger himself started to perhaps overwrite the book when he was revising it.
Rethinking things over so often that the simple basics that he had described became too complicated.
Menger never really began writing further volumes of the book, which was intended as a bigger bulk of books.
When you set yourself a program like that, I write the introduction and I will write each volume later. You are preparing for yourself a nightmare. At the great crossroads of that last 30 years of the 19th century, you have so many different streams of thought. The end of the classical political economy, the beginning of marginalism, Varras in France, Jevons in Britain, and Menger himself. When you have the German historical school, when you have all these, you have to catch up all the time with the development of the economics of the moment. It was too much.
We can see that he stopped reading important books at some point. He got overwhelmed. It's even important new editions have no annotations.
Annotations stopped appearing in the margins of new books. Even the existing ones were lost. One of Carl Jr.'s first memories was of a big fire in which his father was supposed to have burned many of his papers and notes.
We may regret not to have part 2, 3, 4, but we have enough in order to develop thought. Satisfaction of needs, Bedürfnisbefriedigung, availability of resources, Verfügbarkeit, and marketability or saleability, Absatzfähigkeit. It is enough in the sense that we have, at that high level of abstractions, all the concepts that he would have used anyway.
Menger was said to have burned his notes in 1912. We don't know for sure. Some say that the notes were not burned in such a fire, but kindled the house during the World War's cold nights. One month after the war begins, the staunchest student of Menger, Eugen von Bombawerk, passes away. Menger delivers a eulogy that many mourners consider inappropriate.
And then, right, he lived through the First World War. All of it. That's no nice thing to live through.
He was struggling to get food because in Vienna there was a shortage of food. And you can imagine what that means for someone who is 80 years old.
The difficulties that the war created in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where there were worries as simple as how to eat something, and this is why Menger said to his wife, sell the only thing that we have. As long as I'm alive, I want to keep my books, but once I'm not there anymore, you need to survive with our son. So sell.
And it must have been very sad for Carl Menger to observe this destruction of the Habsburg Empire in the last years of his life.
There's not much space for classical liberals like Carl Menger, and that his hopes for a loose confederation of different peoples with different languages is very out of the picture.
It must have been depressing for him, yeah? He has seen the country and the monarchy where he has grown up falling apart.
When yesterday you saw the photos, this was the first time I saw the photo of the old Menger. And what is grabbed my attention, his eyes. He's sitting like the grandfather, but on that photo his eyes was completely young, vibrating young eyes. So he should have remained, despite his old age, a brilliant thinker.
And he passes away in 1921 in a Vienna that is the so-called Red Vienna.
Menger leaves the former empire, now reduced to a feeble country, whose inhabitants foresee an ultimate reunion with Germany. Until the very end, German economists could not be persuaded of Menger's individualist approach or his skepticism toward the central government. But before long, some of them will start praising another Austrian, who becomes a leader of a small German National Socialist Workers' Party. Carl Jr. publishes a second edition of Principles of Economics, but he does so without knowledge of annotations in the margins of books from the library Hermina sold to a collector from Japan. A handful of students of the Austrian School of Economics are dispersed around Europe, where they teach the rising generation. They are not yet aware of two mortal threats: the plagues of communism and anti-Semitism.
The Austrian Mengerian tradition migrated from Europe to the US and only sort of through America then got back to places such as Prague.
My opinion, at least, is that there is a wide gap between the older Austrian school and his work as a founder of that school and what it has become, especially once it crossed the Atlantic.
If you look at the German original of the Grundsätze, you see footnotes and footnotes and footnotes about the history of every aspect. Then the American editors reorganized the book so that the reader would not be so disturbed by these endless footnotes.
Carl Menger's only disciple who went on in economics and continued economics was Böhm von Bamberg, and the most important disciple of Böhm von Bamberg is Ludwig von Mises. And the most important disciple of Mises, passing it on, is Hayek in Europe. Mises is right where it splits in a way. Mises moves at fairly late in his life to the US, and this is Rothbard in the US. There is one German-speaking student called Roland Bader, who studied at university under Hayek. Paradoxically, I'm the last economist teaching Austrian economics at Austrian universities.
That's true that Austrian economics is not routinely taught at universities.
It's very difficult for politicians and for other academics to agree that the individual counts and that the individual is the most important person, that the individual knows better.
Economics is mathematics today, but maybe too much mathematics. And we lose what is the meaning behind the theorems.
This is very dangerous because political economy from the very beginning was about the seen and unseen, direct and indirect.
The same attitudes toward knowledge that supported the German historical school, this interest for data, discarding theory, is also what we face today in the field of economics.
And reading Menger's helps you going back to the real meaning of economic phenomena.
The history of the 20th century and the relationship between the German-speaking world and France is such that this was almost forgotten for most of the 20th century.
Menger was in a way on the losing side of history because a German-speaking thinker was not likely to gain the same influence as he would have if he had written his work in English.
We waited for 150 years before the translation of the principles appeared, 1871-2020. And for the methodology, 1883-2011, 128 years later. The only language of science, major language of science, in which those works didn't exist. Major author, dealing with issues that are really revolutionary. Not group rebellion, but what is the individual about? Who are you? What are you doing when you're making some economic transaction?
We still don't have Menger in Czech, so that's a task for us to make his book accessible to Czech audience by translating it.
Synchronizacja?
Well, nothing, I guess. We might have some, like an article on money, but the books are not available in the Czech language, so not the original foundational works. So that needs to be done.
We published books with various authors on Carl Menger, about various topics on Menger. Then, of course, there is tomorrow's conference. It's the 10th anniversary of the Austrian Economics Conference that we biannually do in Vienna, and the other second year is in Latin America.
It was the centenary of his death, and in economics we like to make big events for such occasions. He deserves to be recognized.
If Menger was still alive, he would have still a lot of work to do. Perhaps we should say that we have a lot of work to do.
I think if Menger just appeared today and see how things were going on in economics, he would be upset by the arrogance of economists.
Maybe would be disappointed about the dependence of sciences from politics.
He would criticize the loss of individual freedom that we have, over-regulation.
He would have learned how many of his worst prophecies have become true. But then maybe he would regain optimism in seeing how rebuilding is possible, how again bottom-up things can re-emerge, how important are the more invisible parts of the capital structure, which he had appreciation for.
He would welcome the general reduction of custom walls, that we have practically a free trade world, and we have globalization.
Positively surprised by the accessibility of books.
Whether it's electronically or in form of libraries or in printed versions.
How easy it is today.
He would love that everybody can study, that we have equal opportunities.
He would also be a strong supporter, I'm sure, of academic freedom, because science is a free competition of ideas.
I think he'd be totally immersed in the fascinating study of how this present tense of ours has emerged out of history.
And second, he would like the new materials for the fishing equipment.
And would he, equipped with the newest fishing gear, visit Lake Chosten? And how would he react had he known that this great fishing area was created after flooding in 1997, Manjove, his grandparents' beloved village?
Te życiorysy umykają ludziom. Umykają takie postacie jak właśnie Carl Mengera, które są postaciami światowego formatu. Nie sądeckiego, ale światowego formatu. Menger nie pasjonuje mnie jako ekonomista, tylko bardziej mnie pasjonuje też jako postać, która została tak wymazana z historii. Tutaj w Nowym Sączu i w Galicji. Jest to zupełnie zaskakujące. Przecież to był człowiek, który tak naprawdę mógł odwrócić losy polityki, gdyby historia z Rudolfem inaczej się potoczyła. Człowiek niesamowicie wpływowy, człowiek o niesamowicie otwartym umyśle. Takim umyśle, jakim myślę niewiele osób w Galicji miało. Tak zostaje zapomniany. Dla mnie to jest po prostu nie do pojęcia i to mnie pasjonuje w Mengerze, dlaczego tak się stało, dlaczego tak się ta historia potoczyła. Gdyby dzisiaj po Nowym Sączu przejść, gdybyśmy wyszli teraz na rynek tutaj, na plac, po którym Mengera w wózeczku może matka woziła i zapytali się ludzi, kto to był Carl Menger, myślę, że nadal jest to nieliczny odsetek ludzi, który by wiedział, o ile by ktokolwiek wiedział. Więc to ciągle wymaga pracy nad tym, żeby tę postać przypominać.